Edye, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the GCP update that just dropped, like really, really recently, what it is and why it matters. So talk to us, Edye.
Talking about GCP and where that is the good clinical practice, okay, just to really make sure we're all on the same page. And what we're talking about here is a doctrine that has been produced by the ICH and is a globally accepted doctrine on how we should perform clinical trials. So, as we know, different jurisdictions, different rules, different best practices. This is one of those that actually spans the globe. So, it's a really important document. And I should say the ICH is the International Council for Harmonization. So that was really their whole purpose in coming together, was to harmonize the different guidance documents. And GCP is the good clinical practice guideline that they initially proffered, right? And now we have so many different revamped and subject specific guidelines that we refer to them based on their different guideline classifications, right? So this one that has most recently dropped is a revision from E6, which started as revision or reference 1 in 1996. It was revised into 2016, and now it's been revised again. And we've finally gotten the final guidance here in 2025 as to what they're going to do. And what this is really about is updating technology and structure of GCP. I mean, when you think about innovation and clinical trials and how quickly we move, how quickly things like AI have inundated our space, it's very hard for any regulatory or guidance body to keep up, right? And to have the regulations actually in real time, if you will, with what's happening. And so this was a recognition of, look, we need to not just change or update, but actually rehash, reorganize. So there's a whole different structure here. And there's a few key pieces that I think are of great interest with.
Let's start with you throwing the AI bug down there. Are they actually referencing AI?
No, so they're not actually referencing AI. What they're doing is they're referencing technology at large, and they've implemented an entire new section all about how you should go about data integrity. And they're not assigning that section, to be clear, just to sponsors or just to investigators. It's truly a whole section that is, new to the doctrine on data protection. And that is everything from the integrity, how it's recorded, all the way through to the metadata, depending on how you're storing it, how you're sharing it, all of the different computer systems, any type of technology you're using, how are you validating that? So it's a huge change in terms of GCP. This is the first time where we see a whole section saying, no, if you're going to use a system, this is what your validation has to look like, and this is what your data protection has to look like, and you have to carry the metadata through. So this is a game changer from that perspective.
So does it get into issues of patient privacy, which in the US is governed by OCR,
Right.
unlike data protection and patient protection, which is done by the FDA? Does this have an impact on OCR?
It has the broad GCP strokes that you would expect in terms of obviously respecting patient and participant confidentiality, and making sure they're informed throughout the entire process and respecting them as a participant and as a human. But it doesn't try to breach over into GDPR territory or HIPAA territory.
Which then takes you to the question that you are kind of hinting at as well, which is patient advocacy. Is there any section on patient advocacy in there?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say it's outright advocacy per se, but what we are seeing is, are you going to return participants' results directly to them? What's the plan for that? We're seeing an emphasis on trial by design and quality by design. So very big emphasis there. And again, these aren't principles that were never mentioned before, but now they're being delineated. They're being more prescriptive. We're spending more time on them, or we're going back through from the roles and responsibilities issues and saying, hey, in the past, we were a little murky on, hey, you're kind of in charge of this and you should sort of be in charge of this. Now we're saying outright, sponsors, you are in charge of this. Investigators, you are in charge of, like, we're being much more direct. If a sponsor decides to use any type of a provider, even if it's being used at the site, but it was directed by the sponsor, they can delegate, obviously, authority and ability to look at data, et cetera, so that they can perform their duties, but they retain responsibility for that vendor, for that oversight, for everything that that vendor does. They do not get to delegate that in a full capacity to the site or investigator.
What's interesting is you mentioned it's ICH. Is it binding on companies within the US?
So it is because the FDA has pushed that direction, right? So the FDA has an expectation that its research is done in conjunction with GCP. That wasn't necessarily true 30 years ago, right? So this is a new construct that's come to the table. And I would say for the first even 10, maybe 15 years that GCP was at least in existence broadly, it was still a recommended doctrine. You had certain therapeutic areas because of their funding, like if you were at an NCI designated cancer center, you were going to have to operate in GCP. You're obviously always operating in FDA regulated trials in that space, and you're a federally funded entity. So that's a no brainer. You're going to get GCP certified. But I also know a time where, if you were in a different part of research or a different part of even a medical school, it might not have been as relevant. Now you're seeing IRBs even require it at a base level GCP certification. And then obviously, depending on what you're working in, you can have more specific certifications.
Even though I spend so much time in the GCPs, what are GCPs?
So, good clinical practice is a doctrine of essentially ethical points, right? So, that's where it starts out. And I always remind people the history behind this is really the Declaration of Helsinki, right? So, that predates and the World Medical Association. They came together and began ICH to create this harmonized set of doctrine guidelines because of what we said earlier. And so, they have a set of principles. And each one then delineates down into, of course, procedures, policies, expectations. And so that's how it's structured. And
But what's interesting is none of what you said is laws. So how do you enforce GCPs?
right. So this is where basically in your contract with your sponsor, you've agreed that you are a GCP, not accredited, but compliant, if you will, site, right? That you've been appropriately trained, you have all the appropriate procedures, resources, et cetera. And you're giving carte blanche to that sponsor to audit you according to GCP. It's in your contracts. It's in your protocols. It's in your, data and safety monitoring considerations that were approved at the IRB. So that's how they're enforcing it. But you're right. Outside of that contractual language or like a reference to compliance in the contract, it's not an outright law. It's a regulation. And it's a, ethical doctrine.
Is it even a regulation though?
GCP is not a US regulation. So yeah, it would be considered an ethical doctrine that is,
Right.
I would call it like incorporated by reference, basically, because the FDA says you have to do it, and the FDA does have regulatory authority.
What are the key differences between E6R3 and E6R2?
For me, like I said, it's the risk-based quality management emphasis that we're openly endorsing that across the board. We're openly endorsing principles of quality in greater depth and detail. So we're not just saying we need this to be quality results. We need participants to be safe. We're delineating more into what does that exactly mean? What is quality bit design? What is that concept? And we're not just saying it once we have a patient who's on study at the trial. We're saying from the moment we have this concept or this idea, we should be integrating quality all the way through. So greater emphasis there, which of course all of us quality and compliance people love. Greater emphasis, like I said earlier, on roles and responsibilities, really ensuring that they're much clearer defined, that the sponsor roles and responsibilities, frankly, are much broader and more delineated. And while you can delegate to service providers as necessary in our industry, that does not absolve you of, the responsibility for their work. And that leans back again on quality, data protection, reproducibility of results, and the relationships from sponsors to CROs to actual research teams and research sites. So, a couple of really key areas there. It also establishes, and for those of us who love our documentation, a clinical trial record.
You talk about risk-based quality analyses, which is really where the FDA has been pushing since I want to say like 2015, 2016, 2017. Except what I'm really seeing is, no, no, no. What we're going to do is we're going to have a standard level everyone gets. And then we're going to do additional monitoring visits as opposed to, you know what? Maybe your site that has no subjects yet doesn't need the audit at all. And the one that's your highest enroller, maybe they get more audits because there is subject risk there. In your experience at a practical level, how is that playing out?
We are not adding, but we're not necessarily rolling back, right? We're still a little worrisome about that. I think some of that is somewhat geographical and demographical because obviously, as you know, there's, hubs for your FDA centers. So, and this isn't new information, but this is where I've always talked about the tea leaves of pay attention. Know all your organizations in your state or your region. If suddenly 3 out of the 5 medical schools in your region got surprised by an FDA audit, guess who's coming to your door? Whether you have a subject on trial, whether you have a mishap, whether it's just your turn. And so there's some of it that's reading the tea leaves of like, is there just a particularly, is it just your wave, right? The newer trials, like I think what you see coming to market in terms of IRB and FDA approvals in 2025 might get a slightly different analysis than the ones that were essentially the trials that were essentially grandfathered in. But I think the further we get into and the more harmonized regulations and ethical doctrine we have around the concept, you're going to start seeing probably a pushback almost even at the IRB level to say, at some point, like, look, we want to encourage this research to occur. We don't think the risk dictates this level of auditing. This is, we're just doing this because it's the way we've always done it, as opposed to it's really, truly. And I think you'll see too, a lot of your programs around human research protection programs are grateful.
Edie, thank you so much for coming on. This was amazing. We're going to have more of these. And you were talking a little bit ago, Edie, about you like to read your guidances, you like to read from the source, you like to read the regulation, then talk to people. This is what we're doing. We're having those conversations so you out there in podcast land can go, oh, the R3 guy update came out. What does this mean for me? Why does it matter? Come check us out. Subscribe. We're going to have a lot more coming on.